When we think of ancient Sparta, we usually picture this unbeatable warrior society, right? The ultimate military machine. But what if I told you that this entire formidable society was built on a knife's edge, haunted by this deep, secret terror, a fear of the very people who made their whole way of life possible? Today, we are going to dig into that. We're going to ask, just how afraid were the Spartans of a massive revolt from within? And this sentence, right here from the ancient historian Thucydides, this is our smoking gun. It's our starting point. What he's saying is that basically everything the Spartans did, their laws, their foreign policy, you name it, was all seen through the lens of one massive, overwhelming problem: their huge captive population, the helots. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll lay out the problem. Then, we'll look at all the chilling evidence that points to this deep-seated Spartan fear. But then, we're going to hit a major contradiction, something that just doesn't add up. That'll force us to reevaluate everything before we finally land on a more nuanced verdict. So, first things first, who exactly were the helots? Well, they weren't exactly slaves in the way we might think. They were a state-owned population of serfs, basically tied to the land they worked for their Spartan masters. But here's the kicker. They outnumbered the actual Spartan citizens by a massive margin. Some estimates say as much as 7-1. Just imagine that for a second. That creates this permanent, simmering threat of rebellion just beneath the surface. With that context, let's start building the case that Spartan society was absolutely shaped by a constant, nagging fear of a helot uprising. And believe me, the evidence for this is pretty powerful and kind of terrifying. First up, we have something called the cryptia. Now, this wasn't just random thuggery. This was an official state-sanctioned policy. You can think of it like a secret police for young Spartans in training. Their job was to go out into the countryside and secretly hunt and kill the strongest, smartest, most capable helots. The goal? To cut the head off the snake before it could even form. It was about controlling the population through pure, unadulterated terror. And the scale of this brutality could be just staggering. Thucydides tells this one horrifying story. The Spartans announced they were going to reward 2,000 of the bravest helots for their service by granting them freedom. They held a ceremony, the helots were crowned, and then they were led away. And they simply vanished. All 2,000 of them secretly executed. It was a chilling message to any other helot who might be thinking of stepping out of line. And this paranoia, it wasn't just about these big, dramatic events. No, it was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives. The writer Critias tells us that Spartans always carried their spears, everywhere they went. But even more telling is this little detail. When they stored their shields at home, they had the handles removed. Why would you do that? Simple. To make them totally useless as weapons if the helots ever managed to get their hands on them. This is a society on permanent, high-alert lockdown. This internal fear even dictated their foreign policy. Get this, the Peace of Nicias, this huge treaty meant to end the first half of the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, had a secret clause. And it legally required their arch-rival Athens to send military aid if the helots revolted. Think about that. You're so worried about your internal problem that you write it into your most important international treaty with your biggest enemy. That's how serious this was. So the case seems pretty much closed, right? A state just completely paralyzed by fear. Well, not so fast. Because the historical record tells another completely contradictory story. One where, honestly, the Spartans don't seem scared at all. Let's talk about the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC. At this absolutely pivotal battle, the Spartans brought 5,000 of their own citizens, and alongside them, 35,000 helots. Let that number sink in. At one of the most important moments in Greek history, the Spartans armed a force of helots that outnumbered them 7-1. And that brings us to the central puzzle here. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. If you truly believe your servant class is a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode, why on earth would you hand them thousands of weapons and teach them how to fight? This just flies in the face of everything we've been talking about. And Plataea wasn't just some weird one-off event. If you look at the timeline, you see a clear pattern. It starts small, with a trusted helot guide at Thermopylae. Then you get the massive deployment at Plataea. Later on, they actually start enrolling helots as frontline heavy infantry, hoplites, and promising them freedom. And eventually, as their own citizen numbers started to drop, they created a whole new class of soldiers made up of former helots. Okay, this glaring contradiction means we have to take a step back and reevaluate the whole situation. Maybe this fear wasn't as simple as it seems. Maybe there are other things going on that could explain these two very different stories. Okay, let's take that common idea that Spartans hated campaigning far from home because they had to babysit the helots. That makes sense on the surface. But what about their neighbor Argos? Argos was a major military power and a bitter enemy, always waiting for a chance to pounce the second the Spartan army was away. That geopolitical reality is a perfectly good reason for Spartan caution. And, it has nothing to do with the helots.
And here's what might be the real key to the whole puzzle. Not all helots were the same. It's very possible the Spartans directed most of their fear and their brutality at one specific group, the Macedonians. These were the people who had been conquered more recently, they still had their own identity, and they were the ones who started the big revolts. But the Laconian helots, they'd been under Spartan rule for centuries. They were way more integrated, maybe even seen as more reliable, the kind of people you could trust with a spear on the battlefield.
So where does all of this leave us? We've got pretty solid evidence for deep, systemic paranoia, and then equally solid evidence for a surprising amount of trust. It's time to bring these two threads together and see if we can figure this out. So let's tally it up. In the case for fear column, we've got this state-sponsored terror of the crypteia, the mass executions, the shield handles, all proving that fear was very real and baked into their system. But in the case for confidence column, you've got them arming 35,000 helots and creating entire military units out of them. That shows either a remarkable level of trust or, at the very least, a willingness to take a massive, calculated risk. The truth, as it so often is probably somewhere in the messy middle. Spartan policy wasn't driven by just one single emotion. It was this complex, shifting mix of deep-seated paranoia and cold, hard pragmatism. The fear was real, absolutely, but it wasn't paralyzing. And when push came to shove and they needed soldiers, necessity forced them to trust the very people they were so afraid of. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. The entire Spartan system, all their military might, their famous discipline, it was all made possible by the helots. But maintaining that system required so much oppression that it created this permanent, ticking time bomb at its core. So you have to wonder, was the very foundation of Sparta's greatest strength also, in the end, the seed of its fatal weakness? Something to think about.